Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Comp Lit. Today, we are diving into the Scarlet Letter. We always begin with this question of why read? Why am I talking to you about this? Why am I reading this book now? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. But all I can say is I'm really happy that I dove back into this classic. This is a book that I read in high school. I know, in fact, that I read it in high school because, there were some books that I was assigned in high school that I did not read. But I know that I read this one because I was very, very proud of a term paper that I wrote in 11th grade English, which is usually American Lit, which is when I read this book. I wrote a term paper on the symbolism of plants in the book, The Scarlet Letter. It's honestly kind of a touchstone in my academic career, which is funny because I think back then you could just get away with just pointing out that something was symbolic. It was all you had to do was identify, in fact, that something was symbolic, and that was enough for an 11th grade high school teacher back in 1986. Today, we're going to go a little deeper, and in a tiny departure from how we normally operate, I want to tell you about my goals today, which is just to remind you of how amazing this book is. If you are American, chances are that you read this in 11th grade for American Lit, and this is one of those high school books that people seem to have loved. It's a little like Gatsby or To Kill a Mockingbird. I get kind of mixed reviews from people on Catcher in the Rye. I think a lot of the Shakespeare that we were made to read in high school was not everybody's favorite. But this is a book that people remember loving, which is so great because honestly, this is an incredible, incredible book. So I want to remind you of all the ways that it's great. And in fact, I want to kind of dig into some of those ways because I am going to hazard a guess that most of us do not remember this book particularly well from high school. I don't think I've read it since then. And if you are with me, you can just listen in today and kind of, take a walk down literary memory lane and enjoy hearing about all of the ways that this book is so good, or perhaps today will entice you to go back to this classic. You are also going to pick up today on a subtext that will surprise none of you longtime listeners of the Foxed Page, which is going to be a very serious anti-puritanical subtext. I was so happy to realize time and time again that Hawthorne himself is actually very anti-puritanical. This book in many ways is not a promotion of what was happening in the middle of the 17th century in our very young country. And I loved some of the ways that he articulated it. I have this long-held belief that many, many, many of our faults as a nation come from the fact that we were founded by people who really believed in a lot of fire and brimstone and who were very stern and who were all about shame and who were all about repression and who were all about rules and very rigid morality. As someone who grew up in Northern California in the 70s, that's kind of anathema to everything that I experienced. I'm really happy that somehow my parents had really moved far away from the Puritan ethic, but I really do think that a lot of the ways that our country was built on these tenets has these very, very long-term ramifications. I also think that perhaps I picked this book up because I'm interested in Boston at the moment. For those of you who are listening to the Fox Page and are maybe not sports fans, or at least not Boston sports fans, you might not know that recently my family has become owners of the Boston Celtics, which sounds absurd even as I am saying it. And honestly, it still feels totally absurd. This is a lifelong dream for my husband, and I too growing up in a household that is not a sports-loving household. I just had no appreciation for sports whatsoever. Met my husband when we were very young and became a Boston sports fan, particularly a Celtics fan, when I was 20. So honestly, it's been 35 years of loving the Celtics. It's the beginning of a really interesting chapter for us, and I'm really excited about it. And one of the ways, of course, that I'm wanting to experience all of this is by digging into Boston through a literary lens. And let me tell you, it has been funny to me because what it has come up with so far, when you very first think of Boston and literature, Scarlet Letter, The Crucible, Moby Dick. This is a very puritanical, fire and brimstone, witch hunt kind of a situation. And I'm looking forward to some other things. I really want to read Dennis Lehane. I've never read him before. I'm going to read Small Mercies. There are a bunch of different things that I want to look into. I was even thinking maybe we do a seminar on Bill Simmons' book about basketball, but I don't even know if that book is something that we would even tackle. given that we're not huge into nonfiction here, and certainly not into nonfiction books about sports. But I was thinking that I should have a playlist on the YouTube channel that is all books about Boston, which will be just like anti-puritanical propaganda for the most part. The other thing that I wanted to do is have a playlist on the YouTube channel that is like all of the books that we read as 15-year-olds that were totally lost on us. It's going to be like all the classics that were wasted on you in high school English. These books are so good. And I mean, honestly, every single one of the ones that's sort of part of the big American lit canon, they are all worth going back to and are so interesting, of course, because when you read them as an adult, it is very different than reading them when you are 14 years old. Okay, for those of you who love an agenda, today we're going to start talking about plot, which is so interesting. I'm not sure that the Scarlet Letter conjures the idea of really well done plot, but I was absolutely struck by this. We're going to take a quick look at that. We're then going to look at the fact that this book is a romance. It is not, in fact, a novel. And Hawthorne was very clear about that. The subtitle of this volume is a romance. It is The Scarlet Letter, a romance. And obviously, I mean, I hope you're understanding that that's not like a Harlequin romance. That is a different genre of prose, and we're going to talk about why that's important. And I can bet that that is something that your 11th grade English teacher did not dive into. We're then going to talk about the frame that sits around the main story of the Scarlet Letter. Some of you did not probably read that in high school, even if you were meant to. But it is a fascinating way that Hawthorne is adding all of this verisimilitude and doing all of this kind of very modern meta stuff, even in 1850. We're then going to talk about history, speaking of 1850. It's so interesting. I mean, this is a novel that's written in the middle of the 19th century, but it is hearkening back to the middle of the 17th century. So here we are, you know, in 2025, 26, oh God. Anyway, we're well into the 21st century. And this is something that essentially 200 years ago was writing about 200 years before that. It's a fascinating way to look at history. That will be an excellent segue into talking about this book as this kind of Gothic novel and asking some questions about, like, so what? Why is it part of that tradition? And what was Hawthorne doing with all of that imagery and all of those tropes? We're then going to talk about women in the novel, and we're going to close with a very optimistic look at the way that Hawthorne was really empowering people, particularly women. I mean, for a book that's very dark, I mean, I think people remember this as being a very dark book. There is such a strong message of optimism, which is a really good place to close. I actually lied before we dive into the plot. I want to orient us just very quickly, because I think that having an understanding of the period when the book was written and a couple of other important details is very helpful when we think back about it. So Nathaniel Hawthorne was born on the 4th of July, which kind of killed me. He was born in 1804, which is crazy to think about. That 1804 doesn't sound like that old, but this is when our country was 18 years old. I did that math actually before I prepared the lecture, or while I was preparing the lecture. So I'm fairly certain that math is correct. He was born in Salem, which is also funny to me. I mean, if there is any city that you know in Massachusetts other than Boston, it is likely Salem, famously known for its witch trials. Salem is 22 miles away from Boston. Nathaniel Hawthorne married a woman named Sophia, had a couple of kids. They lived in a place called the Old Manse, and he wrote a bunch of sketches about the Old Manse that are very famous. They also spent a lot of time in Boston. He was a writer, as I just mentioned. He wrote a lot of sketches, though, which were kind of in vogue and actually made him a small amount of money. He always had some money problems. And he complemented those sketches with a couple of very important romances, the most important of which, of course, being the Scarlet Letter. He also worked in the Salem Customhouse. And the reason why that is important is because that has a lot to do with this framing device that sits around the main story of the Scarlet Letter. This is this kind of cushy job that he had, and I don't think it was an elected job, but it was very politically established. And he was writing the Scarlet Letter in a very dark time for himself. The Whig Party, which were the revolutionary people who were originally kind of the original revolutionaries, and then that party was in turmoil, and it was growing more conservative in a bunch of ways. They passed that horrible Fugitive Slave Act, where if you knew that a person was enslaved, you had to return that enslaved person to the person that was enslaving them in the South. So things were getting more and more conservative in the kind of 1848 to 50 period, which is when Hawthorne is writing the Scarlet Letter. And suddenly this like cushy job that he had in the Salem Customhouse, where he just kind of chilled and did his writing, where that job was in jeopardy. So it was a time of actually some pretty significant personal turmoil for him. So the Scarlet Letter, as you might gather from what I just said, it was published in 1850. It has never been out of print. Almost immediately, it went into the American canon. And I think, the canon is one of these things that we begin to read when we are in high school. It's really interesting, actually, to think about what the American literary canon looked like. And I actually did a little snooping around on, I probably could have come up with a bunch of this, although I would have thrown in some things that are probably not in the canon, which would have been wishful thinking. But I did kind of an amalgam of what was popping up on a couple of different lists. Obviously, Gatsby, Moby Dick, To Kill a Mockingbird, Huckleberry Finn, Grapes of Wrath, Invisible Man, Light in August, which any Faulkner in high school is a little ambitious. Kudos to anyone who's tackling Faulkner in high school. Beloved is a novel that obviously more recently has been joining the canon, and certainly that would be hopefully a more graduate experience. That is a book that I think would be lost on many a high school student, largely because they just would have to read it sort of quickly, and that is not a book to be read quickly. So the Scarlet Letter is very firmly part of the American canon, always has been. It's also very interesting to situate it in history. Anyone who's listened to the Foxed page, you know that 1850 to 1900 is the Victorian era, which maps pretty accurately onto the rise and the heyday of the realist novel. So we have the publication of Madame Bovary in 1851. For lots of people, that's kind of the start of the realist novel. And it's so interesting to take a look here at what came before, at sort of the predecessor, and in fact, like the very proximate predecessor of the realist novel. I think most of us think of it as a novel, but in fact, it is kind of a different specimen. It's also important to note that this is a very, you think of the Victorian era, which was really not great for women. This is when women were really viewed as decorative and fragile and frail. I talk a lot about the Victorian rest cure, which, is when, like, as a woman, you would be thought hysterical if you, like, displayed any emotion, and they would make you go, like, in a dark room by yourself. That does not sound good to me. The Victorian rest cure that I sometimes have, like, fantasies about is the one where they wheel you out in, like, a wicker chair, and you get to spend, like, I don't know, a couple of weeks sitting out on a beautiful lawn with, like, a blanket over your lap and hopefully with a book. But the Victorian era, famously not great for women, which made it all the more interesting to be so heartened by the fact that Hawthorne, in many ways, is very pro-women. My reading of the novel, wow, I'm going to keep saying that. My reading of the book, the romance, was also heavily influenced this time by the idea of the transcendentalists. So when you think of Emerson and Thoreau and Walden, all of that kind of utopian thinking that was happening in the middle of the 19th century in the United States, it is such a great counterpoint to the Puritans. And it's so cool because Hawthorne was literally like hanging out with Thoreau and Emerson, Thoreau in particular. He like lived across town. They would hang out. Apparently Hawthorne was like a little mystified by a lot of their thinking and couldn't really follow them all the way to the conclusion that these transcendentalists were coming into, which, was a lot about the power of the individual in nature, the idea of kind of self-actualization. That's a very 1970s word to put onto the transcendentalists. And I'm not an expert in this area. But in many ways, I think of Walt Whitman and like all of the like nudity that was going on in these utopian societies. And to me, it seems very anti-puritanical in a way that I love. Speaking of utopian communities, Hawthorne did live at Brook Farm? Yes, Brook Farm community, which was one of these utopian communities. I like that in the introduction they keep using the word mystified, because these things were also kind of mystical in many ways, the transcendental things. But as I was reading through and as we look at the book today, I think you'll hear echoes of this idea of nature as being this very powerful force, and one that stands a little bit in opposition to sort of the predominance of like this very punitive God figure. I would be totally remiss also if I did not mention the fact that there's a lot of really important feminism going on at this point. We have Margaret Fuller, who was a very early feminist, writing in the middle of the 19th century. She was someone who also had a real influence on Hawthorne And I don't actually know the relationship between Fuller and Hawthorne, although he definitely would have known her work. But in many ways, the Scarlet Letter is deeply feminist. And I think, some of that would have had to do with the idea of all of this kind of feminist thinking that was kind of in the ether at that moment. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit more concretely into the book itself. And this is a departure for me. We are going to start by taking a look at some aspects of the novel. I'm not going to have any spoilers here. I'm not going to tell you how things resolve in the end. Of course, with my shitty memory, I just couldn't remember anything that happened in the book, except for a couple of the scenes, which I had written about in my term paper, which really, I had those very firmly in mind. But the plot, predictably, it was sort of lost on me. He is so good at plot. This is a book, talk about pacing. I mean, any of you who are writers out there, you should read this book just in terms of plot and pacing. What I mean by pacing is how he is sort of meting out this information. And even when you just look at it in terms of page numbers, it is so impressive. So this is both going to jar your memory, jar your memory? Yes, it's going to jar your memory as to some of the elements of the book in a non-spoilery kind of way. I'm also hoping it maybe will whet your appetite, because these are some of the big questions that arise in terms of plot. And for those of you who read for plot, they would really keep you reading. I think we all remember the basic premise. Hester Prynne has, in the very beginning, she comes out of the prison and she has this tiny baby and is doomed to wear this letter for the rest of her life. And then one of the questions that becomes fairly quickly apparent is she going to reveal the identity of her lover? If you remember who the lover is from high school, it seems like that would have been kind of obvious from the beginning, but it is not. There is a lot of tension in this book, and I did actually remember who her lover was. And it is something that is revealed, maybe a third of the way into the romance. But in the beginning of the book, if you've never read this before, there is so much excellent tension about this question of will she reveal her partner in crime? And then about 20 pages after one of the more kind of pointed moments when we are wait, is she going to tell us who the lover is? Sort of 20 pages after that, suddenly we are made to feel very concerned about the future of this child. So Pearl is a baby in the beginning, and then we see her when she's about 3 years old and when she's about 7 years old. This also speaks to the excellent pacing on the part of Hawthorne. He jumps ahead in time with just very little explanation, but a way that is organic and seamless and really saves us, in fact, from a lot of tedium. And it is actually when Pearl is 3 years old that suddenly this kind of threat comes to her, and you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen with Pearl? And actually, by that point, I think it is fairly clear to any reader who the lover is. So there's this excellent thing where one of the questions is resolved, but then this other crisis about the future of the child comes into play and keeps us reading. And then another sort of 50 pages later, we have this other important plot point, which is we have this relationship between two men, Roger Chillingworth and Arthur Dimmesdale. Roger Chillingworth, we find out very early on, is Hester Prynne's. He was married to Hester Prynne back in the Old World in England, and he sent Hester Prynne to the United States to kind of set up camp for them there. He's much older. He's got a hunchback. It's actually very Gothic. He's all kind of grizzled and not attractive, and she's young and has, this beautiful hair and complexion and whatnot. They're very seriously mismatched. And I actually think that Hawthorne does such a good job of explaining why Roger Chillingworth thinks that might have worked. And he goes into this thing about how sorrowful he is that he kind of made this young woman be his helpmeet and wife. I mean, it's very, for someone who could be just a black and white villain, there is quite a bit of complexity drawn in Roger Chillingworth, which is amazing. But in terms of plot, we come to this point where he and Hester's lover have become sort of entwined in this interesting way. And there's this big question about what is going to happen with the two of them? How is this going to resolve itself? So I'm not going to go on much further with other plot points because I don't want to spoil anything in case people have not read it. But I think this gives you an idea that sort of every 20 pages or so, we have this new concern that Hawthorne articulates in this very clear and actually very, intriguing and kind of enticing way, which is exactly the way you want plot to work. I mean, of course, plot, we usually have an inciting incident, we have rising action, we have climax, we have falling action, and the denouement. In this case, it is really, I mean, we do have that. We have that same Freytag triangle. Things are rising toward a climax, certainly, that is set up at the very beginning. But there are also all of these smaller arcs, these smaller triangles that are leading us upward in this way that really keeps us reading and makes the story feel very taut. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit more. Okay, we're going to move on from plot and talk about this idea of the difference between a romance and a novel. And often, if in the past we've talked about whether something is a realist novel or magic realism, and I've wanted to situate things in terms of their literary movement. And I like to think that I only do that when it is important. In this case, it is really important, and it's a fascinating lens through which to see the novel. Wow, the romance. So both of them are prose fiction, as opposed to being like essayistic or being some sort of long poetry ode. They're in prose. They both tend to be fairly long and well developed, but the novel is different, and the novel really is coming into the fore right around the time of the publication of the Scarlet Letter. But a novel is kind of wider in scope, and the realist novel, which really is coming into its own right then, is doing this thing where it's wanting to provide a world that is all-encompassing and that the reader can enter into and really believe in. The way that that is achieved is by lots and lots of detail, and detail that is sort of mundane in ways it should be interesting, of course, but that is trying to give you a full picture of someone's life, and in fact, the life of an entire society. In contrast, a romance really has to do with matters of the heart, which is obvious, I think, from the word romance. But it is a very significant thing. I mean, they almost all have to do, and often, with these crazy love triangles and all sorts of unrequited love and terribly harrowing love, very much like the love in this case. But a romance is concerned with matters of the heart. It is also often exaggerated. There tends to be lots of hyperbole. It's a genre that really leans into symbolism, which makes me feel a little bit less proud of my term paper back in high school, because I really was proud of looking at symbolism in the Scarlet Letter, which is one of the easiest things, I am sure, to really grasp about the novel. The romance, as opposed to the realist novel, also has a lot of elements, not a lot, but can have many elements of the supernatural. We do see quite a few elements of the supernatural in the Scarlet Letter, and we are going to look at that. There's a lot of overlap also between the romance and the Gothic novel. So I'm going to just whip down a list of the elements of the Gothic novel. Often there's an element of mystery, often like sort of horror or terror is kind of mixed into that mystery. There are lots of ghosts, lots of spirits, that kind of thing. We have a lot of very dark imagery in the Gothic thing. I mean, think of Frankenstein and think of a dark and stormy night and castles on craggy rocks in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm, that sort of thing. Gothic books often really tend to look at good and evil, which, I mean, the Scarlet Letter, well, it's interesting. The Scarlet Letter is looking at the idea of good and evil, but I think Hawthorne's, as opposed to the Puritans, is sort of coming down on this idea of it's not that straightforward. And certainly society's idea of who is evil is not always indicative of who actually is, a good citizen. Gothic novels, like the romance, tend to deal with a lot of very intense emotion that goes along with this idea of hyperbole and exaggeration. And lots of times they have a lot of psychological suspense. So the Gothic novel was kind of coming into the fore at the very end of the 18th century, so sort of, end of the 1700s into the 1800s. So it's kind of right on time that we have this romance at the end of the period, the heyday of the Gothic novel, because we have this idea of a book-length piece of prose that is leaning pretty heavily on the Gothic tradition. But I would move it into the romance, well, partially because he called it a romance, but also because it's much more concerned with love and with relationships among people, not so much about the wider scope of the Gothic novel. Okay, moving right along to the idea of this framing device that is actually a very big and I think a very impressive element of the Scarlet Letter. So a framing device, it's so interesting in my MFA program. We realized that this came from a very wise professor, that a lot of writing will start with some sort of framing device, and then you'll realize that, in fact, whatever this framing device was, it's really not the point, and the point is what's sort of happening inside the limits of that frame. But in this case, it's very important. So let me back up and explain what a framing device is. And this is the perfect example. So we have this long section at the beginning of the romance that comes after the preface. It's very much a part of the book itself. It is called this, the Customhouse Introductory. So it's kind of an introduction, which, I mean, some people skip. And frankly, I think a lot of high school teachers just are like, okay, don't bother yourself with that. But it is 40 pages of the 240 of the book. So it's not a small part. And what it is it's a description of Nathaniel Hawthorne working in the Custom House in Salem. And we see in these 40 pages, there are a bunch of sketches of people and of kind of life in Massachusetts in 1848 to 1850. And what happens very famously, and I think a lot of people remember this, is that he, it's a kind of a cushy job, as I mentioned before, and he goes up into this, the upper stories of it, kind of an attic space, and he's looking through all of these different manuscripts and whatnot, and he finds the Scarlet Letter. He finds this manuscript that is kind of the germ of what he will turn into this romance that he is going to write. And we're going to take a look very quickly before we talk about the importance of this framing device at two different parts, just so that you have a very clear context of what we are talking about. So on page 5, it says this. It is a little remarkable that, though disinclined to talk over much of myself and my affairs at the fireside and to my personal friends, an autobiographical impulse should twice in my life have taken possession of me. So what this is doing here is just very firmly saying that this is autobiographical. And when someone says autobiographical, even as opposed to memoir, it really is something factual. So Nathaniel Hawthorne is kicking us off with this idea that this is his real life, and he's going to share something with us. He's not accustomed to doing this. This is something that is remarkable. And right away, we have this first-person idea. It's very intimate. And it is really resting on this idea of truth. So then we move through these many sketches of all of these people. And what is important is as he is sketching his job here at the Custom House, we have all of these people who were actual people. So in my copy of the book, which is like a Penguin classic, we have a lot of very good notes on the part of some old crusty dude, American lit professor. We have these very helpful little notes that tell us, oh, this guy was a very important, member of the Whig Party, or this guy was the governor. So the entire first part, this introductory part, is very, very firmly set in the actual moment in history in Massachusetts in 1850. And this actually bleeds into the manuscript itself. So one of the things that happens that's a real echo of this framing device is at one point in the romance, Hester Prynne is having interactions, actually a couple of times, with the governor at the time, which is so remarkable. This is like somebody writing a novel and then having the character in the novel have Governor Newsom stop by. It's such an interesting device because you have something that is firmly fictional, but from the very start and then throughout the whole piece, using actual historical people and events allows Hawthorne to make it feel very, very real in this very tangible way. And it's important to ask so what about that? And in this case, I think it is such an important element of a very important statement that he is making about women's rights and about the way that the Puritan legacy is really impactful in terms of how people see each other and how we are punitive. And ultimately, the ways that despite all of the trappings of American society, that the human spirit can prevail. So now we're going to talk about the big moment in this framing device when our author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, which importantly, our narrator here is the same as our author, very clearly. He's not even inviting us to conflate the two. He actually is the narrator. So on about page 30 of the framing device, we have him coming across this manuscript in the Custom House. And even on this page, we have a couple of different notes. There's mention of a Mr. Pugh, who was a historical figure at that time. He thinks about putting some of these other manuscripts in the Essex Historical Society, which was a real thing. So you have to think about the impact of that. If you are a reader in 1852 who is reading this book, all of these things are real places. I mean, I think it could be a little bit of an Orwellian thing where you're wait, is this story true? Because it is so firmly embedded in, your moment. Of course, all of that is lost on most readers, unless you have all of the notes, and certainly probably lost on high school readers. But one of the things I love the most is we have this novel again, it's not a novel, it's a romance. We have this romance that is really embedded in this kind of tangible historical moment, but it is so kind of high flying in the sense that there's all of this hyperbole and exaggeration and like drama and supernatural stuff. Even here in the framing device, we have this kind of supernatural thing that happens right when he is finding this manuscript. So Hawthorne has this incredible melding of this factual framing device together with this kind of drama that comes with the romance. So on page 30, we have this. The object that most drew my attention in the mysterious package was a certain affair of fine red cloth, much worn and faded. There were traces about it of gold embroidery, which, however, was greatly frayed and defaced, so that none, or very little, of the glitter was left. It had been wrought, as was easy to perceive, with wonderful skill of needlework, and the stitch, as I am assured by ladies conversant with such mysteries, gives evidence of a now forgotten art, not to be recovered even by the process of picking out the threads. This rag of scarlet cloth for time and wear and a sacrilegious moth, which that was so funny to me. I mean, the sacrilegious moth, wow, like what an excellent little detail and what a like irreverent way to talk about it. But I'm going to reread that whole sentence because this is momentous. This rag of scarlet cloth, for time and wear and a sacrilegious moth had reduced it to little other than a rag, on careful examination assumed the shape of a letter. It was the capital letter A. So here we have this really beautiful and detailed discovery that our actual Nathaniel Hawthorne is finding at his job, his like actual job in his actual workplace in actual Boston in actual 1850. And I want to read just very quickly on a little further down here. I experienced a sensation not altogether physical, yet almost so, as of burning heat, and as if the letter were not of red cloth, but red-hot iron. I shuddered and involuntarily let it fall upon the floor. I mean, here we have this like very mundane and very factual thing, and then suddenly we have him finding this piece of fabric that is so like red hot in his hands that he is dropping it to the floor. This is the genius of this book. You have really dramatic, exciting things happening in a way that is really convincing and interesting. So we're going to take a quick minute and just ask, like, so what? What is the point of this framing device? And one of the things it is doing, of course, is providing that juxtaposition between reality, facts, and fiction. But the other thing that it is doing, which is crucial, and it's something that Nathaniel Hawthorne really leans into in the framing device, is that he is situating us very, very specifically in a moment in time in Massachusetts in 1848 to 1850. But what he is talking about, what he is finding, is a relic from 1650. Notably, also, this fabric, this moth-eaten fabric, is wrapped around a manuscript. It is not, I loved this part actually, it is not a full manuscript that Nathaniel Hawthorne is going to transcribe for his readers. He describes it as like maybe like an outline of some facts or like a list of some facts about this woman in the middle of the 17th century. And what he promises the reader is that he's going to turn this into this moving romance. But so we have this moment where we have transcendentalism, we have feminism, we also have that tempered with a lot of kind of reactionary stuff in terms of the fugitive slave law and in terms of some of the original founders becoming, in fact, very conservative. We have all of that turmoil happening in the beginning of the book, and in many ways that is hearkening back. It's like it's mirrored so well in this depiction of all of the politics and all of the kind of Puritan underpinnings that we are seeing very specifically, and it is fascinating to look at the parallels between the two. Very briefly, in the middle of the 17th century, in kind of the 1650 era, obviously Massachusetts colony is very young. At that point, it was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It existed between 1628 and 1690. It was one of the original 13 colonies. Probably most of you remembered that. I actually had to look that up. Probably some of you are also thinking of the Crucible, which is another example of a time, it was Arthur Miller writing in the 1950s, right at the beginning of the really heated part of the McCarthy era, when many, many Americans were being unfairly treated and unfairly interrogated and punished because people suspected that they had communist leanings. And And what Arthur Miller provided was this mirror of the Salem witch trials, where innocent women were being, hanged and drowned because people suspected them of witchcraft. So I love this idea of these two pieces of, we're going to get to the Crucible later. And we're going to look at it in terms of the important play right now that's happening in New York. John Proctor is the villain. I think that's the name of it. But in 1953, Arthur Miller is writing about something that was happening, most pointedly in 1692. And in many ways, that kind of mirroring was happening exactly in the Scarlet Letter with 1850 and 1650. So I want to take a look at history in the novel because it's also just a great way to look at Nathaniel Hawthorne's amazing prose. So this is about 20 pages in. Hester Prynne is still up on the pillory, getting punished as she is leaving the jail for the first time with her young baby. And our narrator, who is Nathaniel Hawthorne, says this on the bottom of page 60. It has already been noticed that directly over the platform on which Hester Prynne stood was a kind of balcony or open gallery appended to the meeting house. It was the place whence proclamations were wont to be made amidst an assemblage of the magistracy, with all the ceremonial that attended such public observances in those days. Here, to witness the scene which we are describing, sat Governor Bellingham himself, with 4 sergeants about his chair, bearing halberds as a guard of honor. So again, this is as if you just wrote Governor Newsom just right into your novel. It adds this real gravitas. It also does make the thing feel much more realistic. It's kind of a shortcut to making the world feel like an actual world because this is an actual person who is in it. So a little further down on the page, we have the perfect segue into this idea of the Gothic elements of this novel, because we have this guy who is an actual historical figure. His name is John Wilson. And this is relatively early in the romance, and this is a very Gothic description, which will give us a little foundation to look at the Gothic elements. You also get a sense here of the way that Hawthorne is narrating this thing. I mean, in some ways, it feels like a newspaper article or like a historical document, which makes a lot of sense because he found, these pieces of information and he is putting them into what is both a romance, but also kind of a historical document. On the bottom of 61, the voice which had called her attention was that of the Reverend and famous John Wilson, the eldest clergyman of Boston, a great scholar, like most of his contemporaries in the profession, and withal a man of kind and genial spirit. This last attribute, however, had been less carefully developed than his intellectual gifts, and was, in truth, rather a matter of shame than self-congratulation with him. There's the shame. I mean, there's the Puritan stuff, man. It is everywhere in this book. There he stood with a border of grizzled locks beneath his skull cap, while his gray eyes, accustomed to the shaded light of his study, were winking, like those of Hester's infant, in the unadulterated sunshine. He looked like the darkly engraved portraits which we see fixed to old volumes of sermons, and had no more right than one of those portraits would have to step forth, as he now did, and meddle with a question of human guilt, passion, and anguish. This really is a great indicator of the Gothic. So if nothing else, the Gothic is concerned with guilt, passion, and agony. Oh, not agony, anguish. So we have a lot of things here. We have this we have the contrast between the light and the dark. We have the idea of sermons, which bring up the idea of good and evil. We have the idea here even of the sunshine. So this unadulterated sunshine it's actually foreshadowing, because in many ways this book ends up being deeply optimistic. But in the Gothic novel, mostly what we have is dark, stormy skies. We have a lot of pathetic fallacy, which is simply when the sort of natural, when the weather of a novel is like a manifestation of what is happening with our characters. And we have some of this exaggeration. I mean, this guy is he's a renowned person. And then we have this description of him that is very dramatic in many ways. So I want to talk briefly about why the Gothic novel is so well suited to a book that is about Puritan America. So just quickly to review, to jog your memory about the Puritan era, this was the tenets. These were the tenets upon which our entire country was built. But so the Puritans believed that we have a direct line to God. It was very much, in reaction to a lot of the kind of pomp and circumstance of certainly of Catholicism, but also of the Church of England. I mean, it was about as stripped down and bare as you could get. It's a religion that really adheres and promotes a very strict moral code. And along with that, a lot of very severe discipline, there were laws. I actually did, of course, have to look this up. There were laws against certain clothing, laws against swearing, obviously laws against drinking. There were laws against laziness. And when I say that these are laws, it's like these things were deeply punishable. Like they would put you up on the pillory or make you wear, some sort of letter to shame you publicly for the rest of your life. The Puritans believed that salvation had to be earned. It was one of these things. I mean, this goes back to a very, very serious religious question that is sort of, it's a large question in every religion, which is this question of like, are people born good or are people born evil? And not evil, but like bad. And in the Puritan world, people are born with original sin because, Adam and Eve, and what we have to do throughout our lives is like earn our salvation. Certainly it rests on this foundation that like our life on earth is just toil, and all we are doing the whole time we are here is trying to get ourselves a place in heaven, and more importantly, trying to save ourselves from going to hell. One of the laws that shocked me, and it should not have, is that they did not celebrate Christmas, which was so sad, but it also makes total sense. Also, importantly, and lastly, Puritans believed in predestination. So there was this idea, which is actually slightly contrary to the idea of earning your salvation. There was this idea that everybody was like fated to have a certain life. Everything was predestined. And throughout the book, the word providence comes up again and again and again. And it has a capital P. And I read that a little bit like some sort of agent of predestination. And in fact, some ways like a stand-in for the word God. I was interested that the word God was not used more in the book, but this idea of providence as being this controlling force is very palpable throughout the book because, in fact, it would have been extremely palpable in Puritan America. So all of this is to say that the Gothic novel, which would have also been in vogue when Hawthorne was young, is perfect for the Puritan setting because really, the Gothic novel is concerned with good and evil. It's concerned with the supernatural, which often can have to do with religion. It's really interested in drama, which, the Puritans, in some ways, it seems like they aren't very dramatic, but man, things were very high stakes. And they may not have had like a dramatic good time, but there certainly was like a lot of dramatic punishing happening. So in order to look a little more carefully at the prose, we're going to look at a couple of elements that are kind of concrete examples of the Gothic in the novel. So one of the things is symbolism. The title of the romance is The Scarlet Letter, which is a symbol. I mean, we are literally having the Puritan people put a symbol of adultery and humiliation on the chest of a woman. And not only that, but Hawthorne is focusing all of our attention on this letter as a symbol of her like ignominy. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that word. That's one of those words I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it, but it is certainly one that you read in this book a lot. We also have talked about the weather as being very symbolic in this book. And I want to touch very quickly on the subject of my term paper, which are plants. So honestly, some of the symbolism in the book, which is very Gothic, can sort of feel heavy-handed. But if you're really buying into the idea of the romance, then you're kind of expecting that kind of thing. And then it's delightful because it's just this very organic underscoring of what's going on. So for example, when Hester leaves the prison and comes out into the light with her daughter, right next to the prison is a rose bush, and it's a red rose that is blooming. And I'm going to take this symbolism thing a step further and not just mention that that is symbolic, but I'm also going to say that what we are talking about here, what it is symbolizing, is this idea of growth, of blooming, of the fact that in the Scarlet Letter there is potentially something beautiful, which there is, and which Hawthorne actually pretty quickly leans into. We find out from the beginning, and partially we know this because of the symbolism of the red rose that is blooming as she is walking out of the prison, that she becomes this incredibly important person in the community. People see her as someone they can commiserate with, just, like by a look, by being like sort of like sharing a sin or a secret just by a glance. But also people come to her with questions. She becomes this incredibly skilled seamstress and is someone who is really invested in serving other people, partially because, she's being penitent, but also it just seems to be very much part of her nature. So you have this idea of the Scarlet Letter as blooming into something else. That's very symbolic. We also have things like, at one point, these black flowers grow out of a grave. which is a pretty heavy-handed symbol for, evil or regret or sin as following us even after we have died. But the subject of my term paper was the different times when Pearl, the young child, uses plant elements to mimic or underscore the letter A. So at one point early in the novel, she takes all of these burrs off of a plant and she fits them, she sticks these little burrs to Hester's letter A, which of course is symbolic of the fact that the existence of both Hester and Pearl is this kind of prickly existence. It's also symbolic of the ways that Pearl herself is wanting to stick herself to her mother, this idea of adhering. And of course, also just the idea that the child is paying attention and is recreating this letter A. There's always kind of the threat that, in fact, Hester's ignominy is going to rub off on her daughter and that Pearl is, in fact, going to repeat her mother's sins. But then later, we have a moment when Pearl takes this seaweed, it's green, fresh seaweed, and she makes a letter A on her own chest. And what we have here, which I am not sure that I argued in my paper, was the idea of the child as mimicking the mother in certain ways, and in many ways at this point in the novel, in the romance, that is. The letter A has already become a symbol of strength. And so what we have is cute little Pearl making it again on her own chest, this symbol of both shame and power. But she's making it out of this green material. And the green, of course, and the seaweed, the living plant, having everything to do with freshness and growth. Green, very famously, having to do with freshness and growth. It also, of course, has to do with envy, but I don't think in the small child we're seeing a lot of envy yet. We also, the fact that it is seaweed speaks to the idea of the ocean as being this kind of maternal force, this feminine force. You can always kind of suspect the ocean as being like a feminist element, partially because, our women's 28-day cycle has to do with the lunar cycle, the idea of the sea as a place to return to in a very kind of maternal way, kind of womb-like way. So when we have young Pearl making the green letter A, it's a reversal in many ways of what her mother is doing, but it's also kind of a refashioning of that. Then the third thing I talked about, because of course you had to have 3 things in your 5-paragraph essay. This was a term paper, so it was longer than a 5-paragraph essay, but you definitely needed 3 different elements. The third was when she takes all of these flowers, Pearl does, and she is adorning herself with all of these flowers that are in bloom. They're things of beauty, they're things of optimism. And when she is adorning herself with the flowers, she is not, in fact, making an A. So what I argued in my paper was, in fact, that this was real evolution because she was not as concerned with the A, with her plant elements, but in fact, she was moving beyond into her own kind of blooming vision of herself. So before we move away from symbolism, I want to take a look at a short little passage that really digs into this idea of symbolism. It also has everything to do with nature, which again, I think we can read as a sort of echo of the transcendentalists. I also, you might pay attention here, I'm interested in the ways that the narrator here is really speaking with this very authoritative voice and is explaining things in a way that seems very straightforward, even when they are supernatural or when they are, in fact, a little heavy-handed. I mean, this whole section is remarkable because it's told in this very sort of plain way, but it's speaking about something that is very kind of dramatic and hyperbolic. So at the bottom of 80, we have this. Sorry, bottom of 88. He's talking about Pearl. The unlikeliest materials, a stick, a bunch of rags, a flower, were the puppets of Pearl's witchcraft and, without undergoing any outward change, became spiritually adapted to whatever drama occupied the stage of her inner world. Her one baby voice served as a multitude of imaginary personages, old and young, to talk withal. The pine trees, aged, black and solemn, and flinging groans and other melancholy utterances on the breeze, needed little transformation to figure as Puritan elders. The ugliest weeds of the garden were their children, whom Pearl smote down and uprooted most unmercifully. It was wonderful, the vast variety of forms into which she threw her intellect, with no continuity indeed, but darting up and dancing, always in a state of preternatural activity, soon sinking down, as if exhausted by so rapid and feverish a tide of life, and succeeded by other shapes of a similar wild energy. This is such an important little chunk I liked, of course, the anti-puritanical thing. What's powerful in some ways is that this scene where Pearl is sort of imagining these trees as coming to life, there's this kind of showcasing of symbolism, of the way that we think about things as symbolic. And in many ways, all of the symbolizing stuff is just like an externalizing of what we think. It's kind of making something manifest. And when he has her doing it here, then when we see it elsewhere in the novel, we have a context to just sort of accept what is happening. This is also a very good example of Pearl as just this like totally unstoppable little force of a creature. From the beginning, you know, she's talked about as being kind of witchy, and she's like an elf, and she's like a little demon. She has so much agency and so much power from the very beginning. Everybody's a little bit afraid of Pearl. And when we get to the end of the book, you will understand why I love that so much. This is an excellent time to talk very quickly about the names. So speaking of symbolism, the idea of pearl is very symbolic. In fact, can seem very heavy-handed if you think about it even just for a second here. So obviously a pearl is something that is grown in an oyster when you have like a little grain of sand that is an irritant, and then around it is grown this kind of, you know, beautiful thing. So pearl, obviously here, is this kind of irritant that through the course of the novel, you know, sort of in the oyster of her mother, grows into this beautiful thing. In addition to Pearl, we also have Hester Prynne. So Hester is interesting to me. I think of like Hest at like the behest of something. This idea, there's so much archaic writing in here because he's quoting a lot of puritanical stuff. There's a lot of like thither and whither, and which is actually kind of fun. There's also a ton of thou and thee and thy, which I love that. What has happened in English is we used to have a familiar you, like a familiar second person. If you think of Spanish or French, it would be like using tú instead of usted. We used to have that whole thing. And it was so fun for me to kind of like parse whether things were, you know, a subject pronoun or an object pronoun or a possessive pronoun. But so we have this idea of hest, which is this kind of archaic English. And hest her, it was like, hest her, I mean, I'm tipping my hand there. It was kind of like the idea that like we should like push her, like at her behest, like at her urging, that we should urge her to do something, Hester. And then for me, Prynne sounds very close to prim, which is kind of like this deformation of the idea of something being prim. And it's also, I think, a little ironic because she is a lot of things and prim is not one of them. We also have Arthur Dimmesdale. So Arthur means bear, but of course we all associate it with King Arthur, who is this very important figure, you know, in all of literature and certainly in English history. And then Dimmesdale. I mean, the idea of Dimmesdale, like a little dale being sort of a private space in nature, but the idea of it being dim. And then we have Roger Chillingworth, who is Hester's husband from back in England. I mean, Chillingworth is like, again, it is so heavy-handed that we should be like, oh my gosh. But in fact, and it does a little bit. I mean, when we find out that this guy is named Roger Chillingworth, it really kind of forces you to make this leap where you're like, okay, I'm gonna really buy into the idea of the Gothic here, and the fact that he has like, he's all grizzled and he's got this hunchback. Like, you really have to kind of let yourself join this world where things might feel a little over the top, but the general fabric of the thing is so good that that element just adds more to the prose. So I want to take a quick look at a couple of the supernatural elements. So obviously the Gothic novel has lots to do with ghosts and spirits coming back to haunt us. And we see lots of ghosts in this romance. We also have a lot of shadows, but we also have some like just like very clearly supernatural things happening. And what's interesting is these supernatural elements are happening in a book that is very firmly situated in like an actual historical moment, like in the real world. And what's nice in this situation in particular, and a little bit throughout, is that Hawthorne is sort of speaking to the fact that these were events that were believed to be true, and that may or may not have been true, but there is a little bit of a questioning of the sort of puritanical mindset. So on page 142, we have this. But before Mr. Dimmesdale had done speaking, a light gleamed far and wide over all the muffled sky. It was doubtless caused by one of those meteors which the night watchers may so often observe burning out to waste in the vacant regions of the atmosphere. So obviously he's like trying to explain why this might be happening, but then things get a little weirder. And then we have a little discussion of of how this might have been received. Nothing was more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances and other natural phenomena that occurred with less regularity than the rise and set of the sun and moon as so many revelations from a supernatural source. I like that he actually uses the word supernatural. Then a little further down, it was indeed a majestic idea that the destiny of nations should be revealed in these awful hieroglyphics on the cope of heaven. A scroll so wide might not be deemed too expansive for Providence to write a people's doom upon. So there's that example of Providence. And I like the fact that it's linked here with doom, very puritanical. And then, the belief was a favorite one with our forefathers as betokening that their infant commonwealth was under a celestial guardianship of peculiar intimacy and strictness. Again, very puritanical. And then we have this last part where this event that originally, he says, has this very concrete explanation is becoming less and less explicable. And so we've sort of followed along with our skepticism. And then the narrator is giving us, in a very straightforward way, a description of how this kind of normal sight has actually become something entirely else, which really does push us toward the idea that, he was skeptical, but this thing actually happened. So we as readers should also leave some of our skepticism aside. So this is still up in the sky. It says this: "The minister, looking upward to the zenith, beheld there the appearance of an immense letter, the letter A, marked out in lines of dull red light." It's so well done. I want to read one more quick section that is actually very much like this, the idea that we have something that's kind of normal and mundane, and then it gets to be somewhat supernatural, and it allows the reader to put aside a little bit of her skepticism. This also echoes some of the things that we were talking about earlier. Again, this is Pearl in the forest. Pearl had not found the hour pass wearisomely while her mother sat talking with the clergyman. The great black forest, stern as it showed itself to those who brought the guilt and troubles of the world into its bosom, became the playmate of the lonely infant as well as it knew how. So this is the perfect explanation, by the way, of pathetic fallacy. This idea that a forest would seem black if you were someone who had a lot of guilt and trouble. I just love the ways that he is both showing us these things and then also kind of explaining them to us. So then, right across the page, we have further description of Pearl. And this is kind of this list of these different creatures who are interacting with Pearl. A partridge ran forward threateningly, a pigeon uttered a sound of such greeting as alarm, a squirrel chattered either in anger or merriment. So I find it very interesting here that what's happening with these creatures is not positive. I mean, the pigeon is sounding an alarm, but then we have this thing where the squirrel, the way that he's chattering, I don't know why I think he's a he. I don't know why I gendered the squirrel. But this chattering is either in anger or merriment. That does speak to this thing over and over, where Hawthorne is giving us these symbols that we can read in both ways. And what's happening, I mean, oftentimes it is very clearly the one or the other, but there is a lot of complexity and gray area throughout the whole entire book. I mean, for a romance that is really involved with good and evil, that is very Manichaean, meaning it's just all sort of either good or evil, there's actually quite a bit of this kind of middle ground or kind of ambiguity. And this is the perfect example that we have, these kind of threatening animals, but one of them, in fact, might be chattering at her with merriment. So then we're moving down a little further. A wolf, it is said, but here the tale has surely lapsed into the improbable, came up and smelt Pearl's robe and offered his savage head to be patted by her hand. So I, of course, love this kind of meta moment here where he's saying the tale has surely lapsed into the improbable. So he's talking about our skepticism, but then he's just sort of reporting it to us. And I love the idea here of this savage head, this idea of this savage and scary, wild, predatory creature, but sort of communing with Pearl because she is so powerful. And then we have just this final sentence. The truth seems to be, however, that the mother forest and these wild things which it nourished all recognized a kindred wilderness in the human child. Love it. Love it. I mean, this is I said this earlier, this is a very wild child. And this idea of pairing her often with nature is extra important if you think of the transcendentalists. This is a moment when nature is seen as almost kind of an antidote for God or like a replacement for God. It's a very powerful moment. And it is no surprise that we see Pearl again and again because, in fact, she herself is very powerful. So one of the biggest elements of the romance is the idea of matters of the heart as being first and foremost, and that is certainly the case here. So this whole entire book is a love story, and it is actually so funny to me because every single time we see Hester together with Dimmesdale, suddenly Roger Chillingworth is also there. And this is one of those moments where you kind of have to just lean into something that is slightly improbable. But the entire book rests on the idea of, well, it rests on a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. But the whole entire thing has to do with this love affair and certainly with this love triangle between Hester Prynne, her lover, and her husband. And along with this idea of focusing just on matters of the heart, we have this kind of drama, this high drama that emerges from that. So, I mean, from the start to the very finish, like very significantly in the very first scene and in the very last scene, all of this like drama in this love triangle is playing out on this gigantic public stage, especially at the very end. We have Dimmesdale at the end. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, like what a public spectacle he makes of the whole thing, which is also kind of in line with the like Puritan idea of punishment and like really making people humiliated. But there is so much drama throughout the whole thing. And also not just in these big public displays, but also just in terms of the excessive emotion. I mean, there is people, no one is having, kind of mild feelings about anything. And one of the ways that you see that most clearly, and I loved this, I started keeping, kind of like halfway through the novel, I started keeping track of these words that seemed like very much about the romance and about meaning like the romance as a genre, which of course is also a little bit like the Gothic novel as a genre. And these are words that like I started keeping track of and tallying how often I was seeing them. And again, I didn't even start till the middle of the book. And there are so many examples. These are words that are repeated over and over and over again. And they really tell us so much about the tone of the thing. So here are the words on my list: tremulous, shudder, shadows, ecstasy. And in some of them, I have like parentheses afterward, like the adjective that went with this. In this case, it was extravagant ecstasy. Passion, hot passion. Agony, a throb of agony. Horror, evil horror, really doubling down on horror. Then we have anguish, doom, grotesque, dread, gloomy, and ghastly. So you see so much exaggeration and so much emotion in all of these different words. And again, these are words that are repeated over and over and over. And it's kind of that idea of really like leaning into the drama of it. And I like also that it was antiquated, which is actually a great segue into this next little section, which was so fun for me, which is that honestly, you guys, this is one of the books that they took to pull all of our SAT words. So if you are in your 50s, I think you know what I mean by an SAT word. There were all of these words that we had to memorize, which honestly, like that is at the core of why the SAT used to be, still probably is, so elitist and so classist and so ridiculously geared toward people who could afford tutors for the SAT and people who had the leisure to like study their little, flashcards with all of these words on them. And they were very specific words that were not even in the parlance when I was in high school. And it turns out that they are coming from books exactly like this. So I'm going to read these to you as a little quiz. You can see if you remember these SAT words. Calumny. I'm going to leave a little gap for you to guess. So if you recall, that means slander. Interestingly, we also have contumely and we also have scurrilous, which are a noun and an adjective, but both of those also mean slander. It is significant that in this book we have calumny, contumely, and scurrilous, which all have to do with slander, which actually is not surprising at all. It's very fitting. Then we have vituperative. I think you all remember that. We have ignominy, which I don't even know if that really deserves to be on the SAT word list because it seems like that one's still in the parlance. Then we have visage, which is, of course, a face, it's a French word for visage, like the face. Propinquity, sere, S-E-R-E, meaning like very dried up. That was probably when we were talking about the burrs. Sedulous, asperity, I think asperity is one we use anyway. Mollified, indefatigable. So those are just a few of them. I have to say that mostly I loved coming across them because, in fact, I did remember them. This is the kind of thing I'm going to remember when I'm very, very old and I don't remember anything else. But if you are someone who might, in fact, enjoy running across those words and feeling like all of those hours that you spent studying in high school were not for naught, that may be another reason to dive in. So we're going to close, I think, very fittingly by looking at the very pro-woman statements in this book. And then with a very brief comment about the end, which is truly the most optimistic thing in the romance. So it's important to remind ourselves at the end here, I mean, this is someone who, it's a man who's writing in 1850 about something that was happening in 1650. It was so surprising to me and frankly delightful how absolutely feminist this novel is. And I think we all remember this, was an absolute pillar of strength. This is someone who was meant to be humiliated, but very quickly we see her exhibiting nothing but strength. And in fact, we see people around her responding to her strength in really important ways. And one of the things that I thought was so satisfying in this is that her partner in crime, her lover, is so weak. He's such a loser. First of all, he's a crazy hypocrite, because he is in a position where he is acting like he has not committed adultery. And he is supposed to be this person of incredible, moral fabric. And yet he has done this crime. And Hester, at least, has been forced to be upfront about it. He's totally not. He's totally hypocritical. He's also, physically and morally so weak. Every time we see him, he's, literally just, practically fainting. And he's always shuddering. And he's always just looking so ill. And obviously that's an important statement about hypocrisy and about this man, but it's also an important statement about the strength of Hester Prynne. And he often, whenever her lover, as the book goes on, they're interacting more, he's always relying on her strength in a way that is really underscoring his weakness and her agency. So I want to read a couple of these very quickly. On page 48, so this is only 8 pages into the novel. So at first he's talking about the English women, and then it moves on to talk about Americans. Throughout that chain of ancestry, every successive mother has transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and a slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than her own. That's also very Victorian, this idea of women as being very, weak. But then we have this. The women who were now standing about the prison door stood within less than half a century of the period when the man like Elizabeth had been the not altogether unsuitable representative of the sex. So fascinating that he is hearkening back to Queen Elizabeth I and really underscoring the ways that her strength was very comparable to a man's. They were her countrywomen, and the beef and ale of their native land, with a moral diet not a whit more refined, entered largely into their composition. The bright morning sun, therefore, shone on broad shoulders and well-developed busts, and on round and ruddy cheeks that had ripened in the far-off island and had hardly yet grown paler or thinner in the atmosphere of New England. There was, moreover, a boldness and rotundity of speech among these matrons, as most of them seemed to be, that would startle us at the present day, whether in respect to its purport or its volume of tone. So we have this really bold description of these very powerful women in 1650, and they're standing a little bit in opposition to Hester, but they're also, the kind of stock that she grew out of. And then on page 73, things get a little more specific about her. He starts out by, with sort of her ignominy again. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And then we very quickly, even in the very beginning when she's first emerging, we see her strength emerging. Hester Prynne's term of confinement was now at an end. Her prison door was thrown open and she came forth into the sunshine, which, falling on all alike, seemed to her sick and morbid heart as if meant for no other purpose than to reveal the scarlet letter on her breast. And then a little below that. Then she was supported by an unnatural tension of the nerves and by all other combative energy of her character, which enabled her to convert the scene into a kind of lurid triumph. So literally, she's just come out of the jail and it's already a triumph. It's remarkable. Then a couple of pages later on 76, we have an even more fulsome description of the way that she really turns this whole thing into a real boon. I mean, It's not great for her, but she's certainly making the best of a not great situation. On 76, lonely as was Hester's situation, and without a friend on earth who dared to show himself, she, however, incurred no risk of want. She possessed an art that sufficed, even in a land that afforded comparatively little scope for its exercise, to supply food for her thriving infant and herself. It was the art, then as now, almost the only one within a woman's grasp, of needlework. Of course, as a fiber artist, I loved this. But I also here, I love the fact, she is providing for her family very much like a man would do. And I love the fact that right from the start, Pearl is thriving. You could argue that it's a little heavy-handed, the way that Pearl from the very beginning to the very end is just this like very powerful creature, but I loved it. On page 80, her breast, with its badge of shame, was but the softer pillow for the head that needed one. She was self-ordained a sister of mercy, or, we may rather say, the world's heavy hand had so ordained her, when neither the world nor she looked forward to this result. The letter was the symbol of her calling. Such helpfulness was found in her, so much power to do and power to sympathize, that many people refused to interpret the Scarlet A by its original signification. They said that it meant able, so strong was Hester Prynne, with a woman's strength. So I love this. And we're going to leave off this discussion of feminism and Hester Prynne here with that, because it's very important there that he's saying that she has a woman's strength and that it is very potent. And I love the idea here of the A, not only as, people sort of looking at it differently, but the fact that people really are seeing it as able. She is showing so much, not only agency for herself, but really becoming, sort of a pillar in the community. I actually lied. I had one more note here, and we have to read this because it's a slightly different point. On 182, we have this statement from Arthur Dimmesdale. "And I, how am I to live longer breathing the same air with this deadly enemy?" exclaimed Arthur Dimmesdale, shrinking within himself and pressing his hand nervously against his heart, a gesture that had grown involuntary with him. "Think for me, Hester, thou art strong. Resolve for me." I mean, I love it. I love it that Hawthorne is just like making him say, like, Hester, you're so much stronger than I am. I need you to think for me and resolve for me. Like a real demonstration of a very subversive sort of feminist figure. It is so excellent. But where I really want to end is with the idea of Pearl. So again, from the very beginning, she's been this very strong, very competent little creature who in many ways is the embodiment, well, she is, in fact, the actual, like, biological embodiment of this passion. So she might be read as like this terrible proof of like a sin, but instead, throughout the whole entire book, she's just like literally like a ray of sunshine. She's constantly a little ray of sunshine. She has intelligence, she has agency, she has confidence, she has candor. Like, she's just like this incredible creature. And so then at the end of the book, we have her fate. And I think when we read the fate of Pearl, we are meant to read, a much idealized fate of someone who lives that way, of someone who lives outside of puritanical law and someone who has all of those attributes I just named. And it's excellent because Hawthorne really wants that person to have success. And this is a very concrete thing that he does at the end here. And this is where we are going to end. On page 243, leaving the discussion apart, we have a matter of business to communicate to the reader. At old Roger Chillingworth's decease, which took place within the year, and by his last will and testament of which Governor Bellingham and the Reverend Mr. Wilson were executors, he bequeathed a very considerable amount of property, both here and in England, to little Pearl, the daughter of Hester Prynne. So Pearl, the elf child, the demon offspring, as some people up to that epoch persisted in considering her, became the richest heiress of her day in the New World. Love it. Love it. I mean, not only is Pearl all of those things, but she then is given the power of money, which is kind of this irrefutable and in some ways very kind of male power. She's someone who will have money. She can survive by herself. She will be able to continue her independence, both in England and in America. She has this incredible resource. So this is a character whose spirit has been endorsed again and again throughout the novel. And then at the very end, we see her really become not the hero, but she is the one who has the extreme reward, and I love that idea. So we're going to close there. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Maybe this has whetted your appetite, and maybe you're going to go back and read the Scarlet Letter. But even if you don't, I'm hoping that you're remembering things from 11th grade. If you're on the YouTube and you remember your high school term paper, put it in the comments. And I think we should all feel very wholesome for having revisited one of these classics that really has a lot to do with the fabric of this nation and happily has left us with a very optimistic message. So thanks very much for listening. Happy reading.